Unmuted.
Hello everyone and welcome to our next SUGUAE event, Dubai. Thanks for joining us. So here is the agenda for today. We have two interesting Sitecore sessions. First session is on MVC A to Z by Corey Smith, and the second session will be on Sitecore Helix by Ender at 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. SUGUAE is a Sitecore user group in Dubai. We are passionate Sitecore developers, MVPs, who are running this group in the Dubai. We believe in sharing knowledge. That's why we are here. For more information, you can visit our website www.sugue.net. I would like to thank our sponsors, HI and Sitecore. Yes, HI is our platinum sponsor and Sitecore is our motivational partner. Let's meet our SUGUAE team. There are 5 pillars behind this group, including 3 and only Sitecore MVP in Dubai. Ashish Bansal is a Sitecore MVP, Nilesh Thakkar, a Sitecore MVP, and Sitecore employee now. Nilesh recently joined Sitecore. Congratulations Nilesh. Pradeep Shukla, Sitecore lead, along with Eman and Ahmed, a Sitecore MVP. So our first session is on Sitecore MVC A to Z by Corey Smith. So let me introduce Corey. Corey is our first speaker. Before passing the control to him, Corey is a Sitecore MVP and leading the team in Proficient. Now let's start with our first session. I am giving control to Corey. Hey Corey.
Hey there, thank you.
Yeah Corey, now it's all about you. You can share your screen now.
Okay, can you make me presenter, please?
Yes.
Okay, just let me know when you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started.
Muted.
Hello everyone. Good afternoon to you guys in Dubai. Good morning to me in the US. Today I'm going to be presenting on Sitecore and MVC. Really excited to be presenting for SUGUAE today. This is an awesome opportunity. A little bit about me first. As she said, I'm 2017 Sitecore MVP in technology. I'm a lead technical consultant at Proficient. Proficient's a consulting firm in the US. I've been working with them for about 5 years doing custom .NET dev and Sitecore development. You can find me on Twitter at Sitecore, and please check out my blog at corysmith.co. And without further ado, so today's presentation is Sitecore and MVC A to Z. Hopefully everyone out there is working on MVC in their Sitecore projects. I really hope that no one's doing web forms anymore. I know that there are some, but hopefully we're getting to a point where it's everyone on MVC. A lot of developers that I talk to, whenever they talk about MVC and share their MVC experiences with me, really the extent of what they use MVC for is controller renderings in Sitecore, maybe view renderings, right? So they don't spend any time outside of the controller and the view, the V and the C of MVC. The real power of MVC, the framework that Microsoft has given us, comes in between, before and after those 3 letters. There's so much stuff that's going on behind the scenes that is available for you to extend and make your own and improve upon. And as you can see in this word cloud, there's a lot of stuff, right? There are model binders, there are controller factories, you've got dependency resolvers, you've got action results, route handlers, etc. The list is really endless. And all these things that you see here, again, these are things that you can extend And these are things that you can leverage to make your application more powerful, more reusable, and more unit testable. So today, with this presentation, what I want to get started with is routing, right? And what is routing? I want to preface this by saying that if your experience with MVC is limited to Sitecore and further limited to just controller renderings, then the routing facilities in MVC have probably been totally transparent to you. You've probably not used them before. In a traditional MVC application, routing is really the entry point into your application. I guess maybe one analog in Sitecore would be the item resolver, right? The item resolver is kind of responsible for taking a URL and figuring out, hey, from this URL, what item are we rendering in Sitecore? Well, routing does a very similar thing. It just takes your URL and says, hey, what controller and what action should I return for this URL? So the big places that you would use this in a Sitecore MVC application would mainly be if you're calling from JavaScript, or you're doing some AJAX stuff and you want to hit your controllers through AJAX. That's one of the big use cases. And out of the box, you don't actually have to do anything. You can call your controllers from the outside of controller rendering. Sitecore has one default route out of the box. It takes this form, API, Sitecore, and then just replace the controller name and the action name in these segments. So if I had a carousel controller with a carousel item action, I can actually hit that action from the browser just by going to /API/Sitecore/carousel/carousel item. Now, if it's a controller rendering and you're depending on data sources and things like that, it's probably not going to work. You're probably going to get an exception if you try to hit your controller renderings like this from the outside. But with a little bit of work, you can make it functional and usable for yourself. And so if you don't like these routes, right, like if your company wants a more branded route like my company name /API, you can easily add your own routes into Sitecore and into MVC. And the way you would do that is just by extending the initialize pipeline and creating a pipeline processor either before or after this out-of-the-box initialize routes processor. So I'm going to take a second to say that where you put your route actually does matter around this pipeline processor and the initialize pipeline. If you want to get the full benefits of Sitecore's MVC pipelines, you should always put your route before this initialize routes processor. If you don't care about those pipelines, then after initialize routes is fine. So again, how to add? Well, it's just a pipeline processor. Many of you have probably written tons of them. And over here on the left, you can see that I just got a pipeline processor called initialize custom routes. And this has got one simple method, a register routes, that takes in a route collection of routes. And so this route collection, MVC has a static property, route table.routes, and this is actually where you're going to be adding your routes onto. So I'm just passing that static route table into my register routes method. And then you can call this map route function. And what the map route function allows you to do is give a name to your route. So I've just called this one my route. Specify what the template's going to look like. So mine's going to look like my route /controller name /action name /an ID. And then you can supply some defaults for this route. So what these defaults do is you can actually say, well, if the controller is not supplied, or the action is not supplied, or the ID is not supplied in the URL, but you see my route, then you can just substitute any of these defaults into these spots, right? And so you can kind of see that over there. All of these are valid routes or valid URLs for this route. So if I just call mysite.com/myroute, you can see I don't have a controller or an action or an ID specified. And what MVC is going to do under the hood is it's going to use these defaults to say, okay, well, we don't have these segments, so we'll just use the carousel controller and we'll use the carousel item action, and then we'll just pass null for the ID, and so on and so forth. So you can see there's actually 4 variants here that all do the same thing almost, except for this one where I'm actually passing my ID in, right? So I've said that my last segment is called ID, And then in my controller actions, I can actually get at this ID segment by just putting it in my action parameter like this, right? So that's going to come from the URL here. But like I said, out of the box, MVC or Sitecore comes with a route, the Sitecore API route, and you can have more than one route per action, right? It's not just one route per action. So that might raise the question, well, okay, how can I tell if my action's being called from one of my routes or if it's getting called from Sitecore's route? Well, we're going to go back to defaults. There's a little trick that I'll show you. With these defaults, it's not only for specifying defaults for these URL segments, right? So this pipeline processor is almost the same as the one on the last slide. And you can see that in my defaults, I've specified the default controller in action, but I've also specified a my route equals true. And you can see that's not one of the segments here, but I can still get to this data. So here in my carousel controller, you can see I can check whether or not this route was called just by going and looking at the route data values and seeing if it contains this my route key right here in the defaults. You notice that I'm not casting this to a Boolean. I'm not checking whether it's true or false. That's really not necessary because the Sitecore route's not going to have my route equals false, and I wouldn't ever go and put my route equals false in any of the other ones. The presence of this key is enough. And so by using this, I can tell, hey, again, this is getting called from my route / controller / action, or if this key is not present in the route data dictionary, then Sitecore must have called it, and we must be using this route or some other one. One thing that I want to point out with this, though, with MVC, there are so many different ways that you can do the same thing. So you'll notice that I've actually got this logic duplicated twice here, and I just want to point out that this first line here, request.requestContext.routeData.values, in the controller, it's a perfectly valid way of getting at the route data. You know, you could even take it a step further and do HTTP context.current.request.requestContext.routeData. That's fine. But in the controllers, a more succinct way would be to just use the route data property that's provided to you on the controller. And what I want to say here is just, I highly encourage whenever you're going and working on your projects, when you're working in your controllers and your views especially, maybe just take 5 or 10 minutes, and whenever you're working in your action in Visual Studio, just type this dot and let IntelliSense show you all the properties that are available. There are a lot of convenience properties like this route data and others that can make your code a lot cleaner and also make unit testing a lot easier, right? So, I mean, whenever I first got started, request.requestContext.routeData, you know, this maybe would be how I've done it, but after looking at those properties, I see, oh, okay, route data is there, it's a lot easier. So whenever it comes time to unit test this controller, for example, with the second line, all I've got to do is mock the route data property. I don't have to go back and actually mock this request object, this request context object, and this route data. So again, when you're in controllers and views, just take a little bit of time, see what kind of convenience properties are available for you. There's some cool stuff. So we've talked about how you can identify your own routes, but again, we're Sitecore developers, so how do we know for certain whether or not our controllers are being called through Sitecore, and how do we know if they're being called through like a controller rendering, for example? Well, Sitecore, whenever it's calling your controllers, will go and put a value in the route data. SC is fall through, and they use a very similar technique. It's just going to be a Boolean. And by looking for this SC is fall through value in the route data, you can tell whether or not Sitecore is called your controller. So I just got some kind of example code here. So you can imagine that maybe this is a controller rendering for a carousel item. My action result, it takes in a carousel ID. And so what I'm doing here is basically, if Sitecore is calling my controller action, then I can just go and get the item from the current data source, right? And then we get our personalization and all that. But if I want to render this carousel item through JavaScript, right? If I want to make an AJAX call to this, well, then I can specify the carousel ID in the query string, for example. And then in that case, I'll just go to the database and get the carousel ID from the query, or get the carousel item that's specified in the query string. You know, if you call through AJAX, the Sitecore pipeline is not going to execute properly. It's not going to find an item. So this data source is not going to be available to you. So you kind of need some different logic to handle that. So yeah, that's routing. A couple of techniques and ways that you could use it. And so after the routing system is executed in MVC, or after Sitecore has looked at your controller rendering and said, hey, I need to run this controller name and this controller action, there's a few more things that happen before the action actually executes. One of those things is the controller factory. The controller factory is going to get run, and that's actually going to build up your controller. And then once the controller is built, then it's going to use something called the action invoker. And what the action invoker is going to do is it's going to say, hey, which method on this controller should I execute, and how do I execute it, right? It's going to go and pull data from the request, serve that into the action, and then execute it and process the result. As a part of executing your actions, MVC is going to run some filters. And so this is where I want to talk about filtering in MVC. In my opinion, this is one of the coolest facilities that MVC provides to us. There's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. Filtering is all about cross-cutting concerns. So what do I mean by that? I mean, cross-cutting concerns would be things that maybe apply to all of your methods in an application, or apply to a lot of your methods in an application, but it's code that doesn't belong in those methods, right? So that's things like exception handling, performance profiling, or logging. For example, say you wanted to do performance profiling of all of your actions in your application. Well, there's certainly one way that you could do that is to go onto all of the actions in your application, start a stopwatch on the first line of every action, stop the stopwatch on the last line, and then, you know, write to a log the amount of time that elapsed during your action. Okay, that's one way to do it. But yeah, that's going to be horribly unmaintainable. And so a better way would be to use this filtering mechanism in MVC to encapsulate that profiling logic, put it in a class, and then reuse it everywhere. And so to facilitate those kind of activities, MVC gives us several types of filters that we can use. They're all listed here. So there are authentication filters. Those are filters that are concerned with making sure that you're logged into the system, right? That's it. Are you logged in? If you're not logged in, let me redirect you to another page. The other type would be authorization filters. These are going to execute after authentication filters, so we know that you're logged in. And now the next question that authorization filters is going to answer is, are you eligible to execute this action, right? Do you have the right permissions? After authorization filters execute, the action filters will execute. And this is the point where your actual action method is going to run. And then once the action filters have run, result filters are run, right? So all of your actions are always going to return either a view result, or a partial view result, or a JSON result, or a content result. The list goes on. And that result doesn't actually do anything until these result filters run. And if at any point in this kind of pipeline here an exception occurs, then you've got exception filters, which will catch that exception and allow you to do some handling. So if you can imagine in the action invoker, whenever all of this stuff is running, there is actually a big try catch. And in that catch statement, they're going to run all of your exception filters. So again, it's another cross-cutting concern, right? How do we handle exceptions? What do we do? Okay, well, we probably want to return users to an exception page and log it. Well, exception filters make it really easy to do that without littering try catches all over your action methods. And with these filters, there are several different ways that you can register them with your application. You can register them globally so that they apply to every single controller and every single action in your application, or you can get more fine-grained and apply them to individual controllers. And in that case, it'll apply to all the actions on that controller, or you can get even more fine-grained and apply them just to individual actions. So I'm going to go into depth a little bit about the different type of filters. Authentication filters I'm going to skip. I'm going to go straight into authorization filters. So we can assume at this point that the authentication filters have verified that yes, you are logged on, or no, you don't need to be logged on to the system, so let's proceed. And if you want to leverage authorization filters, all you have to do is create a class that subclasses this authorization attribute and then override this onAuthorization method. And again, this is going to execute before your action filters. So it's good for things like authorization, of course, but there are also some other use cases that might not be so obvious at first. And one of those would be protocol validation. So that would be like, hey, we need you to always access this action method through HTTPS. Well, an authorization filter is a good way to do that. In fact, MVC comes with a filter out of the box that you can use that will ensure that you're using HTTPS on individual actions, right? So if they're not using HTTPS, okay, well then this authorization filter will say, well, let me redirect you to that HTTPS URL and take care of that. Another good thing is input validation. So authorization filters are actually good for making sure that you're not getting malicious input into your system, and for checking for things like anti-forgery tokens on your form submissions to make sure that you're not having any cross-site request forgery attacks. That anti-forgery token check, that's again another out-of-the-box thing that MVC provides that's very powerful. So one thing to note about these authorization filters is that if an allow anonymous attribute is present on the controller action, they won't run. So if you can imagine, you have an application where you want every controller and action to require authorization, except for one. Well, that would be a good candidate for just making your authorization filter global filter, and then on that one controller you could go and add this allow anonymous attribute, and then your authorization filters won't execute, right? Anonymous users can do their stuff there. They'll be granted permission for it. And these authorization filters, and I'll show this a little bit later, but you can actually prevent further execution of MVC, like your action filters or your action itself, by setting this result property on the authorization context parameter. So after the authorization filters have run, next is action filters. Again, these are going to run before and after your action. And so these are easy to make. You just create a class that subclasses action filter attribute and then provide an implementation for one of these two methods. The action executing method is going to run before your action executes, and executed runs after. The on-action executing method is your last chance in MVC to stop your action from executing. So if in your on-action executed you set this result property in action executing context parameter, you can actually prevent your action from running. And again, that's your last chance. Then, in on-action executed, this is your first chance to look at the result of your actions and do something to it, right? Maybe you want to swap out a view result for a JSON result, or maybe you want to change something in the result for all of your actions. So this is your first chance to do it. After your action filters have run, again, the result filters will run. And result filters, just like action filters, you implement those by subclassing this action filter attribute and then providing an implementation for either one of these. Result filters, maybe the use cases are a bit more limited. Again, these are going to execute after the action, and they're good for things like caching your result. If you've got a special kind of result that's expensive to render, it's a good thing to cache maybe, or modifying your response, right? Your result filters are your very last chance in the MVC pipeline to modify your action result. So I mentioned earlier that you can apply your filters at several different levels. You can either do it globally or on the controller or on the action. So what if you have some action filters applied to all three of those places? Well, they're going to always execute in a predictable and specific order. The general idea is that they execute before your actions and the results from least specific to most specific, and then on the executed methods, they execute from most specific to least specific, with the instance of controller instance filters, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So you can see that first global filters are going to run. Those are the least specific. Then controller filters and action filters, the most specific on action and result executing. And then the opposite is going to be true on the result and action executed methods. I'm still not sure why controller instance filters are not after global filters before action filters. It's kind of weird, but we'll talk about it. Filter best practices. So in Sitecore, there are actually 5 pipelines that you should be putting global filters in. And they're listed right here: MVC.action executing, action executed, et cetera, et cetera. So you can just write a pipeline processor, stick those in those pipelines, and you get your global filter functionality. However, with that being said, I do recommend against global filters in Sitecore. What I would recommend instead is that all of your application controllers inherit from one base controller, and you put your global filters there. The reason I say that is just because if you apply global filters through these pipelines, for example, your filters are also going to run for all of Sitecore's built-in controllers. You don't know what unintended consequences that could have, right? That increases your testable surface. Again, it can have unintended consequences that don't pop up until production that you don't want. So if you really want that global functionality, the best place to do it would be on your base controller, and then you can rest assured only your controllers are going to be affected by your logic and not the rest of the Sitecore application. So with all that being said, I've got a demo to show you guys action filters a bit. So I just got this simple site here set up. This is basically like the default MVC site, and I've got a few controller renderings on it. I've got a nav bar, I've got kind of a jumbotron here, and some content tiles. And I'm just going to hop into the code. Let's blow this up a little bit. 175%. Can everybody see that okay? See if there's anything in chat. All right, thanks, Lee.
Yeah, Corey, all fine.
Okay, great. Yep, so what we're going to do is we're just going to look at my carousel controller. And the logic for the carousel controller is not important. What I'm doing here is not really important at all. The important thing is the client comes to us and they say, hey, on the About page, we've got this lovely carousel, and we want to start rendering this through some JavaScript framework like Angular or React, okay? So you're like, oh, geez, okay, well, we can look into it. And so, I mean, you can just assume that your carousel has some complicated business logic, right? This isn't complicated, but the point is you don't want to change your action, but you still want to somehow get this functionality that you can return JSON to React or Angular or whatever instead of HTML. And so they tell you, okay, well, the way that we want to do it is we just want to check in a query string. If there's a key called JSON and it's set to true, then let's return JSON. Otherwise, let's just return HTML as usual. So, I mean, one way that you could do it is certainly come in here in your action, you can modify it and say if request query string JSON equals true, then return JSON. And that's fine. This is going to get you where you need to be, and it's going to work. But again, it's not going to be scalable, because if you want to, and we know that the client's going to come back and say, wow, we really like that on the carousel, let's go do it on the others. You don't want to be copying and pasting these 3 lines or 4 lines everywhere, right? Because then they're going to say, well, hey, we don't want to use JSON, we want to use some other mechanism to change it. So a better way to do that would just be to start taking advantage of the filtering mechanisms in MVC. So I talked a little bit earlier about controller instance filters, and what that means is that your controllers are actually action filters. You don't have to go and create those separate classes. You can implement this kind of functionality directly on your controllers. So let's think about this for a second. If we want to do this in a filter, we've got kind of 4 big places. We can either do it on action executing, right, before this action ever executes, before we hit this first line, which we don't want because we still want to use our view model, so that one's out the window. We don't want to do one of the results, executing or executed, that's too late. So the best place to do this would be in on action executed, right? We've run all our business logic, we've got a valid view model, now we just want to return that as JSON instead of HTML. So what I can do is I can come in here on my controller and type override, and you can see that there is an on action executing, let me get the right one. Yeah, here we go. So here are both of my action filter methods, and I can do on action executed. And so this method is going to run for every single action on my controller after the action runs. So this is pretty cool. What I can do is I can go in here, and I know that by on action executed, by the time this runs, we've returned some kind of result, in this case a view result. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get a handle on that. So I'm going to do var result equals filter context dot result, and then I'm just going to cast that to a view result, right? The next thing I'll do is I'll just check, well, if the result is null, if the cast failed, like maybe they already returned JSON from the action, then don't do anything at all. There's no point. So the next thing is, let's get this logic out of our action. Let's get it back to what it used to be. We'll cut that, move that down here to on action executed. And so we've already determined, hey, we've got a view result. So the next thing is, do we want to replace it? And if the request.queryString JSON is equal to true, then yes, we do. I'm going to change this real quick. We don't want to just use the request property on the controller. We're going to get that off of the filter context. So, yep, this is still the same. And so now at this point, we know that we want to swap it out. So what we can do is we can go and get our model. We can grab this view model by just looking at the result, and there's this nice model property, right? So whenever you do return view, what it's really going to do is it's going to make a new view result, and it's going to stick whatever model you put here onto this model property. So we can grab it like that, and then we can just say, hey, on our filter context, let's replace the result. Let's do a new JSON result. We'll set the data to our model. So JSON results, instead of a model property, they have a data property. It does the same thing. And then we need to set our JSON request behavior so that it'll work on GET requests. And we're done. So it's a few more lines of code, but we didn't actually have to change anything in our carousel action. So let's take a look at this and see if it works. I'm going to publish this to my Sitecore site. Hop over here, refresh the page. Wait for Sitecore to do its thing. There we go. So it loaded. And now we should have some new functionality where we can go onto the query string and say JSON equals true. And whoa, getting a different result. And our page isn't loading, but notice we're still getting our HTML from the layout. If you look right in here, there's our JSON. So it's kind of working. We're 50% there. But the page isn't rendering. This is unacceptable, right? Well, I'll explain why this happens. In a traditional MVC application, you've usually only got one controller responding to a request. Now in Sitecore, we know that that's not the case. In Sitecore, you could potentially have thousands of controllers responding to one request because you could have thousands of components on a page. So on a traditional MVC application, by default, the view result doesn't change the content type of the response. This doesn't do anything. However, the JSON result does. So in an MVC view, if you do new JSON result, whenever this thing executes, it's just going to go and change the content type of the response to application JSON. Well, that's fine if you're only returning from one controller because you probably expect that behavior, but here in MVC on Sitecore, that's not good because, well, we still wanted all these other controllers to get rendered properly. But that's fine, we can still handle it. So if we think about it, we know what's happening. We know that this JSON result is overriding the content type, so why don't we prevent that from happening? Well, that would be a good candidate for result filters. So we know that whenever onResult executing runs, right before this JSON result executes, there's a content type we like. And we know that right after this JSON result executes, there's a content type we don't like anymore. So let's take advantage of the result filters and stop this from happening. So I'm going to go in here and do override. And we'll do onResult executing. And what we can do is we can just grab the content type that's already on the response before our result executes. So I'll just do filter context, .html context, .response, .content type. We got it. So now we need to stash it somewhere. Well, that's not a hard problem. If we go to filter context, the filter context actually has a handle on the current controller that's executing, which means that we've got access to the current controller's view bag. This view bag is a very interesting property. This is basically another way for you to pass data from your controller to your views, but it's an interesting property because if you see here, it says, I don't know if it's too small, but it says it's a dynamic object. So this property actually acts a lot like JavaScript does, right? You don't have to go and say this view bag is going to have property A, B, and C. You can add those at runtime, and the compiler doesn't care. It works just fine. And so we're going to take advantage of that. So we can just go here and type viewbag.content type, and it's just going to work, and then put our content type on it. So now we know that we can go and get our content type out of some easy store. Okay, so we've got our content type saved, and the next thing is now we need to reset it. So let's override onResult executed. And in this case, we're just going to go grab our content type back out of the view bag. So we'll do filter context.controller.viewbag.content type. And now we've got it back. And now let's reset it on the response. That's it. So now, whenever this carousel action executes, right before it executes, nothing's going to happen. Right after it executes, on action executed, it's going to run. It could potentially swap out our JSON result. And then after that's happened, then whenever the result executes just before, we'll grab the content type, whatever it might be, and then right after the result executes, we'll set it back. Okay, so let's see if it's worked. Let me publish again. Okay, let's refresh. And with any luck, we'll see the page get rendered again, but our carousel is just going to come back as this little block of JSON. No questions. And there we go. We fixed it. Okay, that's awesome. Now the client says, well, really nice job. We want this on every single controller now. Again, if you wanted, you could come in, you could cut all three of these methods and go put them on all of your controllers. That's one way to do it, but MVC fortunately gives us a cleaner mechanism, and that's where the action filter attributes come into play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my infrastructure folder here, and I'm going to add a new class, And what we're going to call this class is our JSON filter attribute. Okay. And like I said in my slides before, if you want to make your own action filter attribute, then you just inherit from action filter attribute, like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come and cut these methods that I made on the controller. Because remember, the controller is an action filter as well, so these are going to be compatible. I'll paste them here, and then just change my methods from protected to public. And there we go. We've got all this nicely encapsulated in one single class. And now we make sure that whenever we have this filter switching functionality on action executed, the content type saving functionality is going to ride along with it, right? So this is really cool. What changes together stays together. That's going to be in the Helix principles that Anders is going to talk about later, and that's what we're doing here. So now if you want to use this JSON filter attribute, it's pretty easy. You could go in here, and on your carousel you could say, well, just for this carousel, I want this to execute. And so now this JSON filter and all of its code is going to run only for this action. But even more flexibility, you can cut it, and you can go put it on top of your controller, and that means, hey, this is going to execute for every action on the controller. But what the client wanted from us is they want all controllers to support this functionality. So again, you could go and stick this in its pipeline processors and the MVC pipelines. Again, I don't like to do that if I can avoid it. So I've already made my controllers all inherit from the same base controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up my base controller, and I'm going to apply my JSON filter here. And so this means that any class that inherits from this base controller, any controller that inherits from it, they're going to get this JSON filter behavior on all of their actions. So just to prove a point, publish and refresh. And if everything goes well, then the nav bar will come back as JSON. This is not a component, so this is just part of the layout, so that's not going to change. We'll see this on the About page, and then once we go to the Home page, we'll see the same thing. On the Home page, it'll be the Jumbotron and the content tiles coming back as JSON instead of HTML. Yep, there we go. So we're still getting our carousel as JSON. If we look here, you can see the nav bar is coming back as JSON. It's just coming back with a couple of items that have a URL and a URL label. Right? You see that. Imagine that's easily consumable. We go to the home page. Again, we've got the nav bar coming back as JSON. And then here you can see the Jumbotron with its headline, its subtitle. Oh yeah, Mike, I'll restart for you. Yep, so there's everything. Yeah, so this was a demo of action filters. I mean, frankly, what I just demonstrated, maybe not the most practical demo, like this isn't something that you're going to want to go and use on your projects, because frankly, there's going to be a lot more work. If you really want to get like that full headless experience, there's still more supporting infrastructure you're going to have to put in. With that being said, if you were at SUGCON this year, you may have heard that coming very soon in SXA, this kind of headless experience is going to be supported, and I believe it's also coming to Sitecore 9 through the JavaScript services. So really I just chose this because it's a good way to demonstrate both action filters and result filters and their power. Okay, so that was action filters, so let's move on. The next thing I want to talk about are model binders. Again, I think this is one of those things in MVC that are just really, really cool. Model binders can get really complex. We could probably make a whole talk about this. And I think model binders is one of those things that really sets MVC apart from web forms in a huge way. So what are model binders? They're responsible for one thing, and that's populating action parameters. they're really powerful because they can do not only simple models like your bool, your int, your string, but they can also populate complex objects and action parameters as well. And so out of the box in MVC, model binders use what are called value providers to supply these action parameters, and therefore the MVC comes with. They're all about the request. So there's a query string value provider, a form data value provider, a request body value provider, and a route data value provider. But it's very easy to write your own. You could write value providers that come from like the rendering context in Sitecore or any kind of place that you want. And what's really cool about them is that they're a great way for providing data to your controllers without taking direct dependencies on like HTTP context or the quest object, right? So I showed earlier in the presentation, no, that's coming next actually. I'll show you why this is really nice. So here's an example of simple model binding. So in web forms, this was pretty standard, right? And frankly, I still see this in MVC applications a lot today. If you want to go and get something like an integer out of the query string, then you've got to like, do this int.tryparse, grab it out of the query string, and it's gross. MVC, all you have to do is on your action to say, hey, my action needs an int called myInt, and then the model binder is going to go and it's going to look through the query string, it's going to look through the route data, the form data, and the request body, and it's going to say, hey, is myInt anywhere here? Okay, great, it is. It's in a string, so let me cast it to an integer and pass it to you here. So that's really cool. But where it gets even better is when you're working with complex models, right? So if you've got something like my view model here that's got these 4 different type properties, well, this is terrible on the left, right? Now you've got to go and manually grab each one of those things out of the query string. You've got to cast them. But with MVC, it's smart enough with its model binders is, you just say, hey, I need a my view model called my view model. And what the model binder will do is it'll just go and roll through all of these properties, my bool, my car, my int, my string, and it's going to go look for those anywhere in the request and cast them to the correct type for you. So yeah, this is awesome, right? And then the other big thing is if you want to unit test this controller, well, now you don't have to mock the request object. You don't have to worry about mocking the query string or anything like that. In your unit test, you can just pass the my view model as is into your method, and make sure that everything's working properly instead of worrying about all of this boilerplate code. So that's the model binder. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is view engine. This is another thing that I think is really cool in MVC. And so the view engine, this is really just the driver of the view folder structure and conventions in your application. Whenever I first started doing MVC, the first thing that I noticed in the projects is that they always have 3 folders: controller, model, and views, which makes sense because those are the 3 letters of MVC. But what I quickly learned is if I didn't put my views in the right folder, then the application didn't work, right? The controller wouldn't execute properly. And so I kind of assumed that, okay, well, if I don't put my views in the right folder in the views folder, then if I don't put my controllers in the controllers folder, they're not going to work there either. And I'm here to tell you that's not the case. The only thing that MVC cares about through the view engines is where your views live, right? Controller and model locations don't matter at all. So view engines just basically, they look at the route data, they go and say, hey, what controller and what action are running, and then figure out how to find your view. And so by default, like I was talking about with that views folder, MVC is always going to look in this views folder, and then it's going to look for a folder by the controller name, and then it's going to look for a view named after your action. And it'll also look in the shared folder like this. These view engines, they're only going to run in a few very specific scenarios. So they'll run for your controller renderings. If you're returning a view result or a partial view result, they'll return for your they'll execute for your view renderings, and by extension, they'll also execute whenever you call HTML.partial, because this is basically the same thing as a view rendering in Sitecore. So yeah, like today on your applications, if you don't like the way that things are structured, and I don't, because I've worked on a project that was structured controllers, models, views, and had about 100 controllers here, had even more views here, and trying to do any kind of work on that controller was a nightmare because you have to like scroll through the Solution Explorer over and over. Yeah, that's kind of annoying. So, you know, you can restructure your solution, your projects without any code changes, just like this, right? So you can go in your views folder and put your controllers and your view models and have them all live alongside each other and be happy, and it's a very nice way to structure your project, but you might not feel comfortable putting controllers in the views folder. So it's also very easy to just go and say, hey, I want my views to be in a components folder instead, or a modules folder. So how would you do that? That's easy. You just write your own view engine. So here I've got a simple one. It's a mouthful. It's called the Components Folder Convention View Engine. And it's just subclassing this Razor View Engine class that MVC provides. And all you have to do is in the constructor just basically set these two properties, view location formats and partial view location formats. In my case, I'm setting them to the same thing. So right here, basically what I'm saying is, hey, go look for views in the components folder, and then look for a folder named after the controller, and look for a view named after the action. Pretty easy, not a lot of code here. And if you want to plug it into your application, then you've got two options. Either you can go and plug it in the initialize pipeline, and you can have the view engine registered globally through this viewEngines.engine static property. And you always want to make sure that you insert your engines at the top of the view engine collection. So those existing like views, controller, action.cshtml engines, those are also going to be in this collection. So just you want to make sure that yours run first, so always insert them at the top. But if possible, I again recommend not modifying global things like the view engines or global filters. And if you can get away with it, I recommend just going and putting your view engines directly on a base controller, right? Again, having all of your controllers inherit from a common base controller will allow you to get this kind of global functionality, so to speak, without disrupting Sitecore's behavior. So this is how you would do that. On a base controller, you can just override this initialize method, and then after calling base.initialize, add your view engine to the base controller's view engine collection, and all inheriting controllers will benefit from this. Yeah, so like I just said, where possible, add your view engine to the base controller instead of the global collection. However, if you want your view engines to work in HTML.partial, and if you want your view engines to work on your view renderings, you have no choice but to add them to the global viewEngines.engines collection. So if you're not using HTML.partial, if you're not using view renderings, again, prefer the base controller, but if you are, you have no choice but to use this. This HTML.partial doesn't look at the controller's, it doesn't look at the controller's view engine collection. In the case of view renderings, for example, there might not even be a controller for executing the HTML. So yeah, just keep that in mind. And then the other thing I would say is favor more focused view engines rather than fewer monolithic view engines. And what I mean by that is, if we go back a couple of slides, imagine you could make a view engine called like application convention view engines, where you have a list of 30 different location formats here. But again, I recommend against that. I say that you should have more tightly focused ones, right? So instead of having one big application convention view engine, you know, break that out: components folder, view renderings folder, convention view engine, controller renderings folder, convention view engine. However you want to do it, have those as separate, discrete view engines. So before we get to question and answers, I just want to cover one more thing. As we all know, Microsoft has been making a really big open source push over the past few years, especially with .NET Core, but it hasn't stopped there. The entire .NET web stack is actually open source now. I don't know if they take pull requests, but you can get all the code yourself and compile it and step through it. And you do that here at aspnetwebstack.codeflex.com. So if you're curious just about how MVC works or stuck on something, go pull it, build it yourself, and figure out what's going on. The code's really readable, it's really approachable. The maintainers, they're very active on Twitter, so you can have conversations with them about it. And yeah, whenever you pull down the solution, it's as easy as just adding a new MVC project to the solution, changing the references in your project to, instead of referencing like the NuGet packages, reference the MVC projects in the solution, set some breakpoints, and learn. That's it. So I've got for you guys questions and answers.
So do we just talk?
Yeah, Mike.
All right. Sorry, I am getting over a cold, so I'm a little, that sounds a little weird. So yeah, I stepped in late and kind of missed most of this. But for that model binding stuff, let's say whatever your thing is sending across doesn't match what the model is, what happens?
It just won't bind the properties.
All right, it'll just be null. It'll be null or something like that. Or? Yeah,
it depends. It depends on the type. So there's some very interesting behavior. If we go back, out of the way. So for example, right here with this complex model binding, when you blow it back up, you can see that I'm saying that I'm requesting a my view model. Kind of the expected behavior, in my opinion, is if none of these properties, like if my bool, my car, my int, my string, aren't found in the request, then this thing should be null. But that's not the case.
Yeah.
For these complex types, you're always going to get something, but all of these properties will just be initialized to the default values.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess that's actually all right. I mean, typically the way I'd handle this before I knew about this is, you know, I'd have some kind of services object that would handle this, and I'd inject it into the controller, and it would do all this magical stuff. But I kind of like this actually a lot better, at least for this.
Yeah, the magic there.
Because you just want a poco really sometimes.
Exactly.
And then the other thing with that Razor View engine thing, I don't know, I was thinking, you know, how, you know, if you wanted to tie it into IOC through your container, if you would create like a base controller class, it wouldn't be really nice to do that because you're going to have that be defined in the constructor, very subclass controller. Just wondering, like, it's kind of like a trade-off here, I guess, if you wanted to inject it into it. Well, with, the actual initialized pipeline, you could do that, you know, with on 8.2.
Yeah, I mean, you can still do it, right? Like, yeah, I guess here on your pipeline processor on this one, you could have in your constructor say, hey, I need a MyView engine, and let IOC instantiate that for you. You can also do that with your base controller without affecting the signature of all of the other ones. So you could come in here, and I mean, it's kind of nasty. It's service locator, right? But you could actually come in here.
Yeah, that's.
You could come in here and say, you know, current get service and get your type.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of service locator, but I mean, I get what you're saying.
Right. I mean, you've still got that option.
Right. All right, I'll shut up now. I'm gonna just ask questions. No problem.
Any other questions?
Unmuted.
Oh.
All right.
So I think, Corey, thanks for the nice presentation. It was a great session.
Thank you.
With some great code. Thank you for joining us, all the attendees. And now time for the break. We will come back after 30 minutes with next Sitecore session. It is Sitecore Helix.
All right, guys, I'm going to have to miss the next section. I've actually got to go to work now. So best of luck. Thanks for having me. Have a good one.
Yeah, good job, man. From what I've seen, so that was pretty good. Was this recorded, by the way?
Yeah, it's recorded. We'll share.
Yes.
All right, excellent. All right, do we jump on to the other GoToMeeting? I saw two different ones, or do we stay on this one?
I think we jump.
Yeah. Oh, we jump. Okay.
Jump.
All right. Cheers. Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye. बोल देना separate.